Welcome back to Revelation on Demand Podcast, a podcast dedicated to bringing you revelation from the Bible. I'm your host, Justin D. Myers, and thank you for joining me today. Sorry we've been away for a little bit. I had a fairly busy week 2 weeks ago, and I didn't want to release a half-baked episode. I didn't want to release anything that wasn't completely done, and I definitely didn't have all my regular notes done, so I decided that maybe we just skip a week. Sorry for all of those of you who are listening on a bi-weekly basis. Just kind of out of the blue. I was really tired last time I had a chance to record, and just didn't get around to it because I didn't get everything finished in time. This job that we're at, a new company came in, and they've kept us really busy since they took over, or at least they've kept me very busy. So I seem to have no end of things to do, and it was just time got away from me last week, so I'm sorry about that, guys, and I'm definitely working on it and working on finding rest when I need, that's one of those things that can be hard, especially for people today. We get busy with all sorts of things, and then we forget to rest, and it can really be detrimental to our health. So I'm not going to get too much into, things that are going on in the world today, because I'm sure we'll get into it as we get into the chapter today a little bit more. There's things that definitely kind of allude to things that are happening today, and we will talk about that as we get there. And talking about last chapter, it was a really short chapter. It was Isaiah chapter 4, and it was only 6 or 7 verses. We broke it up into having a study about every single verse, basically. So this time we're going to go back more to our original format where we have, a chunk of verses, and then we talk about those verses. And I've tried to break them up into ways that make the most sense thematically as we talk about them. So we will get into that. Last chapter was about the judgment that was come down on all of Israel for their unwillingness to follow God's rules. We'll see even more of that today, especially in how the things that Isaiah is talking about, he is wishing, or he is saying, will come upon Israel for their disobedience. And then last time we learned that no matter what is going on in our lives, we can always rely on the Lord. We'll get a little bit more of that today, along with stuff that kind of has more I just can't say that word today. It'll make more sense when we get there. How about that? This section is kind of set up like a poem, and it's self-labeled as a love poem, as we will hear when it runs right into it. But it reads more like a parable. So there's another parable that we will go over as the similarities become more apparent. And the poet is using a vineyard as a metaphor for God's people and nations. So whenever it's talking about this garden or vineyard, it's talking about Israel as a nation, not just trying to be flamboyant with the language. It's actually has a meaning behind it. Now, the parable that I want you guys to get in mind is the parable of the tenants from Matthew 21:33 through 41. And that's the one where Jesus is talking about a landlord has this farm, and the tenants go there and they don't pay their rent or whatever, and then he sends people to get his fair share from him. They kill him, and he does this several times until he sends his own son, and then they think that they're going to kill the son and get the inheritance for the thing, and then eventually just completely wipes them out from his farm. So we'll see that in parts of this parable, this poem that we're going to go over today, that is using very much of some of the same imagery and ideas as we get into it. Now, this first section is really short, just 2 lines. So starting in Isaiah 5, I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. Then he looked for crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. So the person writing this, as we know, is Isaiah. And this is from a position of someone who's in a right standing with God. As we can see, he's calling God his love. He's calling him, his beloved. And he's saying that he's done all this work to create this vineyard. And he even looked for, good crop to plant in it. But alas, it has not produced the fruit that he wanted. When it's referring to this vineyard, it's crossing that boundary between parable and poem. We see them both used, this kind of garden and vineyard imagery whenever it's talking about kind of a fertile place or a place that was made to, for specific things to grow or specific things to thrive. We see that it's using more of the idea of what a farm or a vineyard is, where this place is designed to bring out the best fruits in whatever it is trying to do. So when it's talking about this, it's saying that God, created this land for Israel and put Israel together and put it where it is, and, created this very fertile place for Israel to thrive. And then come to find out that Israel was the bad fruit. They're the ones who produced the bad fruit. So we see that when we are in right standing with God and when we are, carrying out God's will, he will put us in a place that is fertile and we will be able to grow and bear good fruit. And as we can see, even if we aren't, in that same standing, if he places us in a good place, and it's not that we're going to bear, good fruit, we need to have that initial, kind of dedication to taking care of what God wants us to do. That's what helps us produce good fruit. He will always put us in the place that we will grow best. The question is, do we see what it is that God wants us to grow in? It also refers to the owner of the land as being the creator. So as we know, God has created everything in this world, so he's the rightful owner. He has the right to do with it as he pleases. So we see that there's several places here where it's talking about this owner doing everything that he could do in his power that should produce good fruit. He makes the land fertile. He puts up the walls. He keeps out the bad things, and he tends to the crops as to the best of his ability. But we see that it's the bad fruit, which comes back to what Israel is, because this again is Isaiah, going to Israel and saying, "Hey, you guys are doing the wrong things. You're creating this poor fruit. You are not following God. You are not worshiping Him like you should." And as we can see, this is another way that Isaiah is calling out Israel at the time. Now we're going to see a similar metaphor when we get to the potter's metaphor, which I'm sure many people have heard of. And it has the same kind of twist here where it's talking about how he is the creator, so he gets to decide what he's going to do with it. So this is, again, another claim to God being the rightful creator of everything and everyone. And then we see bad fruit in this passage. In the Hebrew, it is a word that can mean grapes, but often means stench. It's sticking, rotting fruit. So this word comes up several times whenever it's talking about the bad fruit that Israel has produced when it has not done what God has called them to do. That's something that we ourselves need to watch out for today, is that we're not producing, that bad fruit. We're not serving in a way that creates more darkness in the world and stuff like that. Carrying on back in verse 3, "Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I will tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, it will be destroyed. I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. I will command the clouds not to rain on it. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he has looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress." So we can see here right away in this it starts calling out the people of Jerusalem and Judah specifically. And of course, it explains this whole metaphor that it's talking about, where it says, the vineyard is the nation of Israel and the people of Judah are the vines. And we see that this is his way of calling out the bad things that, Israel and Judah have done. And right off the bat here in verse 3, he is literally calling to Jerusalem and the people of Judah to judge between me and my vineyard. So he's literally ironically calling them to judge what they have failed in. Again, we see that he is saying that God had done everything right. He prepared the soil, cultivated the vines, protected the vineyard. He did all these things to take care of Israel, and they have squandered what he has done for them and have produced bad fruit. Now, agriculture is the backbone of society even today, but back then it was more like, whereas today we have only like 2% of the population that feeds the rest of the population, which I know I'm part of that. Back then it was much more common it was like 95% of the population at this time would be responsible for growing or producing their own food in some manner. So we see very few people who are specialized into other things. Most people did garden or kept animals in some manner at this time to help produce food for themselves. So when we see metaphors in things that are agriculturally based, it may be hard for us to understand today as moderners when most people aren't part of agriculture. But back then, he was using language and examples that were very common to everyone at the time, and they would understand this. And one of these times, whenever we're talking about fertility and talking about these gardens and whatnot, we see that God is being, kind of put up against these other gods of fertility and stuff like that, because some of the most important gods in these times would have been the fertility gods that were in charge of, good crops, good livestock, good chance for new children and stuff like that, kind of these deities of abundance and stuff like that. And we see that a lot of times whenever God is put up against one of these deities, he's doing it better. He's doing it, the right way. He's doing it in a way that doesn't require some sacrifice given to him. And one such deity that comes up is Marduk. He said to planted Babylon like an orchard in their myth, and then lamented over never getting any good fruit from her. And this is drawing allusions to that myth. And of course saying, much like that God, the man who planted Israel where it was supposed to be, has not gotten the fruit. Of course, now God is lamenting over that, but God is also going to take matters into his own hands and retilt the orchard to reseed it, to get it ready for a new crop. And whenever we see the Old Testament compare God to these other deities, or vice versa, compare these other deities to God, we often see that they make it in a way that God is the true God, and all these other mythologies, these other deities are just copycats trying to do exactly what God himself has done. And of course, this goes all the way back to the Satan himself, who is always trying to copy God and do the same thing that God is doing. He's trying to get himself to a position of where God is. Of course, as we know from studying Revelation, that's nigh impossible, and it's not going to happen. But we see these other deities tend to copy God or some attributes or some traits and try to be the God of that sort of niche. And then we see, the Old Testament completely, just take these things and say, hey, you know what? You're that God over there that you think is in charge of that. Yeah, no, he's not really in charge of that. Our God's really in charge of that. So we see often that the Old Testament is kind of using these examples that would have been, prevalent in everyone's minds at the time, and then saying, yeah, that is not from this God. That is from our God. And in this structure, we see him removing the hedge and removing all these protections and everything that he has put up for the vineyard, and now he's letting it, be taken and destroyed. And these hedges that would be planted around vineyards are thick bushes that would make it hard for people and animals to move through, would often make living things choose a different path, and in that would protect whatever, the vineyard or the farm that you put this hedge around. So when it's saying he's removing this hedge and he's literally removing the protection, and the word used here is more like a wall and less like a hedge, but it is still the word for hedge, which alludes more towards like a walled city than just a hedged vineyard, which is him taking the protection away from Jerusalem and letting them be ravaged by the wild animals of the world, by the evils that are out there. And then it talks about briars and thorn bushes. This is usually language that's used to talk about desolate wasteland, or the kind of state that Israel will be left in at the time after all this judgment has come to fruition. And of course, Israel or Jerusalem has been destroyed and laid waste to. And briars and thorn bushes are these plants that are just not good for making food, and they're often pokey, and they are hard to deal with, as well as hard to just be around in general. So it's saying that this is what the state that Israel will be left in after this is going to be hard to be around. It's going to be hard to get anything to grow or to take root in this area again. Continuing on at verse 8, "Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field, till no space is left, and you live alone on the land. The Lord Almighty has declared in my hearing, surely the great houses will become desolate, the fine mansions left without occupants. A 10-acre vineyard will produce only a bath of wine. A homer of seed will yield only an ephah of grain. Woe to those who rise early in the morning to run after their drinks, who stay up late at night till they are inflamed with wine. They have harps and lyres at their banquets, pipes, timbrels, and wine, but they have no regard for the deeds of the Lord, no respect for the work of his hands. Therefore my people will go into exile for lack of understanding. Those of high rank will die of hunger, and the common people will be parched with thirst. Therefore death expands its jaws, opening wide its mouth. Into it will descend their nobles and masses, with all their brawlers and revelers. So people will be brought low, and everyone humbled, the eyes of the arrogant humbled. But the Lord Almighty will be exalted by his justice, and the holy God will be proved holy by his righteous acts. Then sheep will graze as in their own pasture, lambs will feed among the ruins of the rich." So Isaiah starts talking about 6 woes here, and we see 2 of them in this first section. And they highlight the way that Israel has failed and the things that Israel has done wrong in the eyes of God. The first woe is talking about how they have accumulated all this land, they've accumulated all this wealth. They have, as I was saying, the elite band together and collect all this land and accumulated in ways that is against the laws. Because in Israel at the time, there was a law that was the land was divided because it was conquered from Canaan and given to Israel, and it was divided to the tribes in a specific way, so that if someone forfeited their land for whatever reason, they sold it for a loan, they couldn't afford it anymore, whatever it was, or they sold it to buy something else, it was supposed to always come back to them at the 50-year Jubilee. And this was a thing that reminded Israel that the land was not theirs, it was God's, and he could give it to whoever he seemed fit. So we see that at this time, I don't think one Jubilee had ever been celebrated or done in the time Israel had ever had the land of Canaan. So we see that rich people are accumulating land and houses and building these massive houses, and they are not giving it back to the people who should have the ground, and they are accumulating wealth in very greedy ways and making sure that they get the most out of the people below them, and they abuse them in ways and give them loans that are exorbitant and stuff like that. And since they've refused to keep this law, they forfeit the land, because it was part of the contract that God made with Israel that when they inherited this land, they would have to abide by this law, and that would mean that they could keep it But unfortunately, they never, did the Jubilee, or they sold it and borrowed it in ways that were against the law, and therefore, in God's eyes, that makes it forfeit. So they will have to forfeit the land. Then we get into the farm yields, and there's some language here. The vineyard that only produces a bath of wine, and the little bit of grain that makes even less grain. What it roughly is trying to say here, in a way that we might understand it better, is it's only going to roughly produce 10% of the initial investment. So this is not even like 10% return on what you invested. This is 90% loss on initial investment. So the vineyards and the farms in this area were to not be able to produce nearly anything. The second woe is focused on people who have made an idol of partying and flamboyancy and drinking and stuff like that. We see that they didn't properly worry about the real political, social, and religious issues. They were more worried about their, appetites and their thirsts, and their punishment would be that they would hunger and thirst, but not be able to satisfy that. And Isaiah always comes back to pride as being a fundamental issue of sin, where it's always the pride of man that causes many of the sins. And I can understand that, many of the things that we think we should be doing, or the things we think we can get away with doing, often come back to a sense of pride, like, oh, I can do that, or I should be able to do that, or some sort of entitlement of pride, And then at the end, it takes a lighter turn, where it says, the God's sheep will come and graze on the grasses and whatnot in the ruin. And of course, this is Yahweh is exalted when people enact justice and righteousness, or when God himself, enacts that justice and righteousness, he will be exalted. Last section, hang in there. Verse 18. Woe to those who draw sin along with cords of deceit, and wickedness as with cart ropes. To those who say, let God hurry, let him hasten his work, so we may see it. The plan of the Holy One of Israel, let it approach, let it come into view, so we may know it. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and champions at mixing drinks, who acquit the guilty for a bribe, but deny justice to the innocent. Therefore, as tongues of fire lick up straw, as dry grass sinks down in flames, so their roots will decay, and their flowers blown away like dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord Almighty, and spurned the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore, the Lord's anger burns against his people. His hand is raised, and he strikes them down. The mountains shake, and the dead bodies are like refuse in the streets. Yet for all this, his anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised. He lifts up a banner for distant nations. He whistles for those at the ends of the earth. Here they come, swiftly and speedily. So we see the third woe here is the people who are draw sin along like cords of deceit and wickedness, the cart ropes. The people who are, mocking God, saying, yeah, let the end times come, let him come, let his kingdom come, let us see what he can do, sort of thing. It's these people who are leading people astray in ways of things like, oh, you can do that, you can get away with that, you can, why is this a bad thing? Why should we do that? Why shouldn't we do that? Sort of thing. This kind of attitude that we see a lot, especially today, where people are saying, well, why can't I do that? Why shouldn't I be able to do that? And the only answer is because that's not what God's plan is. So that's the third woe. And we see the fourth woe, which is much like the third woe, only these people are those who call evil good and good evil. So we see a lot of this today, where there's people who say that, following God is square, and you shouldn't follow a made-up sky daddy or whatever it is that they have to say, and then they go and turn around and say, oh, well, this is okay, we can do this, and this is right to do, and this is righteous, and this is, they call evil things good and good things evil. And we see that a lot today, especially in the way things are going, day to day. And not trying to get into any politics here or anything, but this is something that we struggle with as a society, especially in America. You know, we see the people turning away from the light and championing darkness in ways that is just ridiculous these days. And something that I guess is not unheard of in history. So as far as, is it worse than it ever has been? I'm not 100% sure about that, but we definitely are dealing with this in many ways today. And we have the fifth woe. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. And I'm sure we've all met people, and I'm sure we've all been that person who's, you know, thought better of themselves, or thought they were smarter than they actually were, or thought they knew something about something that they really didn't. You know, we've all been there. We've all seen that. And this is just one of those things. It kind of reminds us to be humble. You know, when we don't know the answer to something, it's better to ask questions than just pretend we know the answers. Because the minute we run into someone who actually knows the answers, they could, you know, really lay us low. And then the sixth woe is talking about those who are drinking all the time and acquit the guilty for a bribe and deny justice to the innocent. And it's literally using words here like heroes and very unheroic sort of things, and making this kind of irony very prevalent in what it's saying, and just pointing out like these guys make as heroes, but they are doing terrible things, even though they, you know, pose themselves as heroes, or they're worshipped as heroes in the society. So we see this is mostly talking about corruption. This is talking about people who've you know, raised to higher places in life and have become corrupt by that. And then in this last section after the woes, it's talking about how the fires of judgment will begin to burn up the, you know, the bad and the unrighteous, the unjust, all the things that starts to turn everything to ash. The evil and the terrible things of the world will just be burnt away. And we've talked about how you know, God is this fire that purifies the things that we've done in life, and all the hay and chaff and straw and everything will be burnt away, and only the precious metals will be left behind. And the precious metals, of course, being the things we've done for God, the things we've done with God, the things that we've done because of God. Those will be the things that are left. Everything else will be just dust and ashes. And then we see God's hand being outstretched. This is often used as a metaphor for something where God's directly having, you know, influence on that, or directly causing something of that matter to happen. And then he also summons the other nations in this time of judgment. And in this case, he uses them as the tools of his judgment. He uses them to watch over Israel and you know, create the havoc and punishment that he has, you know, judged that they needed. And we've seen this in Daniel, where, you know, Israel was punished for their disobedience by Assyria or Babylon coming in and taking over and making them not a nation anymore, but a vassal. And then the wording in here, it's using, when it's talking about the army that's coming to Israel, that is using very supernatural terms for it, that it's faster and swifter than any human army would be. And of course, he is talking about the Assyrian army that is coming to take over Jerusalem and subjugate them to Assyria. And that is what happened soon after Isaiah was, you know, prophesying that all this stuff would happen. So what's the takeaway for today? I think even when the world is twisting good and evil and trying to lure us from the path the Lord has set before us, we can always turn to him. And no matter what we struggle with, we will find comfort in the Lord and his will for us. And that's just something we need to keep in mind, you know, whenever you're struggling, like, what do I need to do? What's the right thing to do? It's just, we turn to God and say, you know, what does he want me to do? What's the right thing? What's the right path? And we stay strong in what the Lord has sent us to do, even when the world is, telling us we're wrong for thinking that or doing it a different way than the world would see fit. So thank you for listening to the Revelation On Demand podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you catch podcasts from. Please, if you like what we're doing, share this with a friend, family member, or someone from your church. This is a completely private venture and receive no funding from any sources. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please feel free to contact me at revelationondemand@gmail.com. God bless, and see you next time.